Hello, this is Dread, and in today's video topic, we are going to be talking about Bleed, Forge Strike, Forge Guard. So I want to be upfront with this. This build isn't going to be the best build ever, and that's mainly because it is a Forge Guard. So be, you know, understanding of that as we go into this. It's not like the best build ever. So let's just talk about the build, right? So the idea is we're going around with the philosophy of the mana generator spender. So if you don't know, EHG, they have a lot of skills currently that are balanced around the fact that they have a high mana cost and you're supposed to sustain mana to be able to use them constantly. So like for instance, to be able to use a skill like Forge Strike, you need to spam a different skill like Rive to get mana back or run mana regen or whatever you end up doing for mana. You need to sustain that mana. Now, the biggest problem here is Forge Strike actually worth the mana cost? And that, my friends, is the problem here, because if you were to take a different build that was just Rive, right? Just Rive, and ignored Forge Strike, you would probably end up with a better build in general. And that's just mainly because the mana efficiency to damage ratio or effectiveness ratio that Forge Strike currently has is not good enough to make it feel good. Now, of course, it's good enough to do the content, but I'm going to be honest, if anyone else other than me played this, they probably hate it. So I'd heavily suggest not playing this. So let's talk about some other things. Dread, why are you at 1.1k HP at 300 corruption? Of course, you're having a terrible time. I have to explain this. So recently, with the last patch, we had the introduction of Code of the Erased Sentinel. It is a Weaver's Will unique, and essentially it makes it so that a portion of your armor is applied to damage over time. This has been amazing, and that is because generally with a Forge Guard, you would end up with like maybe like 2k HP, but you'd be at like 10k armor. And normally this would make you feel kind of tanky, to be honest, having that much armor. But the problem is, specifically here, damage over time doesn't care about your armor. So, for instance, you'd be at 2k HP, you'd be running around in monos, you get hit by a diamond matron beam or like some poison, and you'd fall over instantly. Now, of course, you have sources of damage reduction on the tree, like 15%, doubled if you use a potion recently. You have access to stuff like Oracle amulets, but that was generally not enough. But thankfully, with Code of the Erased Sentinel taking 30% of your damage reduction against dots and applying to like armor and applying it to dots, that's amazing, right? That's enough to make you feel tanky. So for reference, with my HP value and all that, right? I was like doing, I think it was like 300 corruption, and I had two diamond matrons on top of me, both doing their giant beams on me, and I was able to face tank all the way through it. And that was because of just how much damage reduction I have for damage over time. Now, let's talk about the other side of this coin, right? So I thought, well, if we don't need HP as much, right? How about we go endurance? And oh, let me tell you, that was an interesting decision. So right now I have, I think, well over like 1,000 endurance threshold. So for instance, 60% less damage taken on that portion of my life. And that combined with the armor stacking has been, for the most part, pretty successful, unironically. And that is because instead of running HP on all your gear, you just run armor and endurance threshold, which, is the same kind of slots that would take HP up. Now, there's a few problems with this. The biggest problem is endurance threshold stacking is very good when you have like no uniques in your build. So, like for instance, my Weaver's Will relic, right? The Code of the Erased Sentinel did not hit endurance threshold, so I couldn't push my HP higher, but that would be a little bit more EHP there. My helmet doesn't have endurance threshold on it. My chest can't have endurance threshold on it. My belt doesn't have endurance threshold on it. Essentially, I could push the endurance threshold significantly higher than I currently have if I just had a little bit better gear. So it is a very high investment to cover your HP with endurance threshold. Now, thankfully, Paladin has an ace up its sleeve. Thankfully, to the recently nerfed Sigils of Hope, we can actually get like 75 endurance threshold per sigil, and that's enough to cap us for the most part early on. And of course, later on, we get more endurance threshold on gear, and I'm pretty sure you get to like 1500 HP while also still being capped by endurance. And by then, if you're still at like 70, 80k I mean, 70%, 80% armor, you'd probably end up with a very tanky Forge Guard. And this is multiplied by the fact that we're using Leech, and the Leech number, as you can tell, like whenever I'm leeching anything, like my life goes instantly back up thanks to just how much sustain that I have. So overall, this build was a success. Now, I think Forge Strike wasn't a success, but the dot stuff and like, just in general, the endurance stuff was a success. So I look forward to playing a Forge Guard again with an actual skill instead of Forge Strike. So with all that being said, if you haven't already, I'd heavily suggest leaving a like on the video and subscribing to the channel. Now we're going to go and talk about the build in more detail. I would suggest, though, don't play this version, but use this as a foil to your own ideas. Let's go in game, shall we? All right, here we are in game with the character. As you can tell, the name of the character, very flavorful to what we are doing, deleting mana bars. As you can tell, the animation is stupid, and I love it. So let's talk about skills, shall we? So for Forge Strike itself, we take 4 points travel into Light Forge, although the attack speed is really nice. And of course, 1 point into Beneath's Alarm so that we can play an actual skill instead of one with a ridiculously long cooldown. And of course, we take 2 points in Ironbound. I do have +3 on my Forge Strike, by the way. We want this crit multi later because it's converted into bleed penetration. 1 point into Singular Craft for extra bleed chance, of course. Then put to the sword. This gives us a more attack speed modifier and also gives us physical penetration for bleed, which is what this crit multi is turned into. And of course, 4 points into Serrated Blade for 100% penetration with bleed and 40% bleed duration. We want as much bleed duration as possible because it's a large modifier to our damage. Then 5 points into Heavy Strike. That more damage is great, and that stun chance is great because we can use Bellows to make our stun chance equal to damage over time. This is one of the only reasons that this build is even viable. And of course, 1 point travel into Engines of War, then 2 points travel into Temper, then 1 point into Detonating Ground. Apparently, this node actually does work with the rest of the tree. So essentially what it does is it just hits again, essentially, and it scales with all the other modifiers on the tree, so giving us extra damage. Also, so that Ignite becomes useful later on. So let's talk about Rive. Rive here, I just want to let you know that I have specifically the Time and Faith node, but I do not have the affix that gives me mana when I use Rive. This is very impactful. It gives you like 10 extra mana whenever you use Rive, and that would literally double your mana, like mana creation. It would mean less time Riving, more time Forge Striking, which would be absolutely wonderful. I never got this affix because the game hates me, of course, as we all know this. So, but let's talk about Rive. So we take 5 points into Flurry. This is one of the reasons why Rive is even good, is because not only does it have a favorable animation, as you can tell, it also has, of course, way more attack speed. So like, for instance, we take it like Multi-Strike. As you can tell, Multi-Strike has that really bad animation, so we don't use Multi-Strike. Vengeance would be great, but Vengeance doesn't have as much damage as Rive has, so we have to use Rive. And that is because of a few other nodes, as we'll talk about in a second here. So 2 points travel to Sever, 1 point travel to Twisted Fangs, 1 point to Flame Drinker's Blade. Essentially on single target, this will be about like maybe 100% penetration currently. I'm not investing too hard into this because we can get physical penetration with bleed, so we don't technically need this. It's just this is a lot of extra damage for free for using a mana generator, right? A mana generator that gives us a lot of damage. Of course I'm going to use that. And of course, one node into Assassin Sustenance to get all that extra damage leech. This is for everything, including dots, which is really good for us. Then 1 point travel to Rending, 1 point travel to Cadence, and then 2 points into Crescendo for extra mana gained on that third strike. Getting extra mana gained is absolutely wonderful, of course. 4 points into Iron Reach. We want our Strike 2 to be huge. That is because it will increase the pull area. So for instance, Challenge can pull literally like, I think like a pretty decent chunk of the screen towards you. It is a very good node. This is the main reason why we're using Rive specifically, is because it pulls everything towards you so that your Forge Strike AoE covers it all and then kills everything, right? Because the idea, the concept is to go to a pack, pull everything, generate mana, and then kill them with Forge Strike. That's the whole point of the build, right? So having all of that pull is absolutely wonderful. Then 1 point travel to Brutality, then 1 point into the 15% pull, which is amazing on bosses. And of course, stereotypical dot volatile reversal setup, of course. One thing to note though is phase reality is really strong because we have a node that converts dodge into armor. So we actually end up with a lot of extra armor, flat armor. Now, the problem is this is not being calculated with my armor value right now because it's a visual bug. It does get actually converted to your armor. It's just not showing you it currently, which is fine. But that's about how much armor we're getting to our, of course, our, our armor flat, which is then, of course, multiplied by our armor percentages and all that. You get the idea. Then Abyssal Echoes. We're using Abyssal Echoes because mainly it starts Ignite on a single target so that we can consume it with Rive for extra physical penetration. And it also gives us a buff, which gives us 20% more damage and 20% attack speed. I heard this build likes attack speed. So of course we're using Abyssal Echoes. Now we have sigils here. The main reason we are using sigils is to use iron sigils. As you can tell right now, we're at 600 endurance threshold, but if I use my sigils here, which is pretty easy to utilize because we get a lot of mana with Rive, so we can kind of just hold down right click, or hold down R until we get it. And as you can tell, we get significantly more endurance threshold, which makes the build function, which is great. Eventually, later on, this will allow you to invest more and more into HP until you end up with maybe 1500 HP and 1500 endurance threshold. So that'll be fun. So yeah, that's pretty much it for the skills. Let's talk about the blessings real quick. So important blessings here. Right now, I'm using Black Sun for Void Res, of course. Eventually, you'd want the upgraded version, but it doesn't really matter. Lightning Res from Ending the Storm. You very much so want Bleed Chance from Raging Dragons. We'll talk about Crit Avoidance in a second here. Then Endurance Threshold from Herot is very important, of course, so we can get even more endurance threshold. Then, of course, eventually you'd want the upgraded version of Spirits of Fire. We haven't really needed this because we get plenty of armor anyways, but eventually you do want to go and fix that. Now, let's talk about gearing. So for our helmet here, I Dawn helmet is your best in slot because that 400 flat armor is increased by all your percentage armor. So you really want to have a Dawn helmet. It's your base, so you want that, of course. Now, of course, instead of having that physical penetration with bleed, you'd probably want the Rive mana gain node. That would give you extra mana gain with Rive, which would make you, be able to forge strike more often. Of course, percentage armor or endurance threshold, probably endurance threshold, and then flat armor and reduced bonus damage taken from critical strikes. This at tier 5 and the tier 5 on the chest as well is enough to reduce crits enough to the point where we don't have to get the crit avoidance at all, which is great. And of course gives us flat armor, so it's multi-purpose. Then, of course, for amulet, we're using a bleeding heart. I have HP on it. You could have frailty, damage over time, damage. You mainly want damage on your bleeding heart. I just had this bleeding heart laying around, but eventually, of course, you do want to start snacking HP when you get enough endurance threshold from your helmet, your relic, your belt, right? So, of course, eventually you'd want some HPs here or there. Then for the chest here, increased armor is your best in slot on the suffix because you get so much flat armor. Eventually, you'd want a Dawn plate with increased armor on it, with, of course, the reduced bonus damage taken from crits. Instead of that physical penetration with bleed, you could probably go with bleed duration. That would be better. Same thing on the helmet instead of that strength. And of course, +2 to forward strike. You don't actually want +2 to forward strike. You can go for physical penetration and bleed or whatever, or strength. It's whatever. You don't actually need +2 to forward strike. It just gives you a few points. It's not mandatory per se. This was just the best chest I had laying around. Eventually, you'd want a Dawn chest with a 500 flat armor or whatever it is. I think it's 650. You want that. Now, I'm using Isidora's Tomb Binding. Why am I? Because as you can tell, it gives us a very large amount of armor. Do we need it? No. Why am I using it? Because all of my belts are garbage. I don't have. Eventually, you'd want a belt with flat armor as the implicit. Then you'd want tier 7 endurance threshold, and then tier 5% increased armor, and then whatever other prefixes you can get. But I don't have a belt like that, so we're using this instead. Ring here, you want T7 endurance threshold, endurance percent. You can also get dodge rating here, which is then converted to armor, which is great. Physical damage and damage over time would be great. Same thing on this other ring, same kind of concept. Then for the gloves here, I do have tier 7 stun chance. This is mainly because we have this node here bellows, which makes this increased damage over time. So it's 130% increased damage over time, specifically for Forge Strike. As you can tell, it's a lot of extra damage having that. And of course, the attack speed's great. The dodge is converted to armor, and all of that combined makes Wing Guards into a really best in slot item for this build because the faster we attack as well, right? The more mana we gain per second, which means more Forge Strikes, which is all good around, right? And of course, for the boots, I have Blood of the Exile. Eventually, get one with armor instead of movement speed, but I like movement speed. It has a lot of good stats. You want to ignore the 30% more ailment damage to moving enemies. It's cool and all when you're doing monoliths and all that, but it's not necessary. Now, you just like it because it has a lot of bleed duration on it. Then, of course, Code of the Erased Sentinel. Mine is really bad. All I have is frailty on it, essentially. But eventually, you'd want endurance threshold on it, damage over time, stuff like that. Specifically, endurance threshold or something like that. You could also get dodge. I don't know if you can get dodge on it. I'm not entirely sure. Now, for idols, of course, we have a Throne of Ambition because it makes base tanking bosses really easy, getting that 40% more armor. Because remember, the more armor you get, the better it gets. Because every single point after 70 or whatever, it becomes better and better as you get more armor. There is diminishing returns though. Eventually, there is a certain point where investing to armor doesn't do anything for you anymore, but we haven't reached that point yet with this build. Of course, damage over time, armor percentage, physical damage over time. Eventually, we would want 4 different bleed duration idols here on our bar, but we don't have those, so I don't have them. Of course, like fizz damage over time, stuff like that. But eventually, you want bleed duration idols, and then of course the throne, and like an idol like this for the increased physical damage over time. And that's pretty much it for the idols. Let's talk about passives real quick. I forgot to actually talk about passives. So mainly, we care about time and faith. We really like armor clad. We want strength. We don't care about HP anymore with this build. Void Knight, we grab 5 points in the Fizz Res here in the Void Res, 5 points in Sorrow and Steel so we can get access to everything. Paladin here, we take 8 points in Defiance. It gives us more Elemental Res, and believe it or not, mana from the attunement is actually pretty good because it means the more mana from our attunement, right, or more mana in general, means the less time that I'm spending doing this and monoliths, which is great. So cool. And of course, the blind chance here, this is to enable Abyssal Echo's more damage buff, which is great. And then, of course, melee ignite chance, like whatever, right? Then Forge Guard here, 10 points into Battle Hardened for the increased armor on hit. This is really strong. We definitely want this. Eventually, 10 points to Guardian, getting that 60% increased damage over time with our Forge Strike is great. 8 points into Thornmail for that flat armor. We definitely want this. 10 points to Smelter's Wrath. This gives us 140% bleed chance, which is amazing, and 140% ignite chance, which is also amazing for our Arrive ignite stuff. Then, of course, Iron Reflexes to convert dodge into armor, meaning that everything that is flat dodge is good for you, which is great. 3 points travel to Infinite Bulwark, 5 points into Liquid Armor for the less damage over time taken. I don't really like the potion part of this, but it's like whatever. Then 8 points into Molded by the Forge for the attack speed. Now, as you can tell, I don't have the attack speed at the top of Sentinel here. I don't have this attack speed yet. Eventually, when you get to like level 100 and all that, you could get like this, and you'd have even more attack speed. And of course, this build definitely would get better with time if you got the Rive thing, got better bases, stuff like that. This is definitely a time investment build. You like invest time to actually make it good. So, all that being said, this has been Dread. I'll have to go do something else. Bye.